from the top. My dear brethren and sisters and young people, we've chosen Jeremiah this morning for the exhortation because we commence the reading of the book of Jeremiah. It's a very large book. It has one subject, and that subject is Israel. And I want to talk about Israel today to remind you of the things that relate to Israel and remind you also that we are to be watchers. And what we watch is Israel. Now, I'll commence with the chapter in Isaiah that talks about Jeremiah. And it commences in chapter 30 and verse 1. It says, "Woe to the rebellious children, saith Yahweh, that take counsel, but not of me, and that cover with a covering, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin." Now that's the first verse of the chapter that refers to Jeremiah the book. The middle verse of that chapter is the subject of the book, and it is verse 17. It says, 1,000 shall flee at the rebuke of one, at the rebuke of 5 shall ye flee, till ye be left as a beacon upon the top of a mountain, and as an ensign on an hill. Now, that's exactly what Israel is to us. She is a beacon on a hill, on the top of the mountain, and an ensign on a hill. Now, everyone can see what happens in Israel if they're interested in that subject. That's what Israel is meant to be. So whatever happens to Israel is something that we should notice and see. In the last verse of that chapter in Isaiah 30, it tells us that Tophet is ordained of old, yea, for the king it is prepared. He hath made it deep and large, the pile thereof is fire and much wood. The breath of Yahweh like a stream of brimstone shall kindle it. Now we can react rather negatively to that verse because Tophet is the burial ground. And it's a reminder to Israel and to all of us that Tophet is waiting for all those who reject the things that are true. Now, we discovered also, and I have mentioned this before, that Jeremiah is one of 4 places that mentions the Pentapolis. If you recall, the Pentapolis is the 5 cities of the Philistines. And you say, well, what is the importance of that? And I say it refers to end-day events, because these events are happening in our time, in our lifetimes. So while Jeremiah appears to be a book about Israel's history, it is in fact, in great part, a record of events happening in the land today. So it's end-day information. So as we commence the readings from now, as we go through the book of Jeremiah, I want you to register those passages of scripture that could possibly refer to end day events. Now, in relation to the 5 cities of the Philistines, it tells us in Samuel that these are the golden emerods which the Philistines returned for a trespass offering unto Yahweh, for Ashdod 1, for Gaza 1, for Ashkelon 1, for Gath 1, and for Ekron 1. Those are the 5 cities of the Philistines. And those 5 cities, the Pentapolis, is mentioned in Zephaniah, in Zechariah, in Amos, and here in Jeremiah. So it is referred to 4 times. And that, of course, indicates to us that it's an important subject. And we ask, well, what's so important about it? Israel are in the land of Palestine today, struggling with the Philistines who occupy the land alongside. And the interesting about the Pentapolis is there's one of the cities, one of the 5 cities missing, and that is Gath. Now, we know from our understanding of Gath, it was the city of Goliath, and you would have thought it was the most prominent of the 5 cities of the Philistines. And yet, in each of these 4 occasions where the Pentapolis is mentioned, Gath is not there. It's a feature of end day events. And the reason is they can't find Gath. They found Ashdod. They found Ekron. They had to dig it out of a pile of dirt. They found Ashkelon, Ekron. What are the other cities of the Philistines? Gaza. Now, each one of them are commented on. And it's obvious from the references that Gath is missing because the archaeologists don't know where it is. A feature of our day because it was the most prominent of all, but it's disappeared. Now, I was born in 1944. And in 1948, of course, Israel became a nation. They became a nation in a day. So it was a remarkable event. And of course, I'm 6 years old when that occurs. And in 1967, of course, when Jerusalem became Israel's possession again in the 6-Day War, we were adults over in the Perth Youth Conference, and we were listening riveted to the radio about Israel possessing Jerusalem once more. Now, a brother, Bruce Phillip, had a shortwave crystal radio that he could tune into Jerusalem news. And I can remember wanting to do that more than anything, to hear what was happening in Israel. I did not have the skills to make it happen or the funds to make it happen. In the end, I could not do it. But we wanted to know what was going on in Israel. A brother, Charles French, from the West Ryde Ecclesia, came to Lakemba, where I was, and he would lecture on Sunday night. He was always interesting, and we all listened intently. He published a little pamphlet called The Present Day Events, and it was all about Israel. He listed events that were of interest to Bible prophecy to help us in our watching work. But Brother French died at age 62 by falling off the roof of his house. He was doing some repairs, and we lost contact with the present day events. Joan and I and our 3 children went to live in Morisset, and we went to the Gosford Ecclesia, and I came across a brother, Charlie French, the eldest son of Brother Charles French. And I was amazed to find that he still published the present day events 40 years after the death of his father. It was the same old format, tightly packed words on an A4 page to keep the printing costs down. And it was still published around the world. I marveled at the consistency of this, a witness all this time. I was reminded of this by an email I received from Brother HVE Lafferty from the US, where he published an article called Splinters. And I know Brother Lafferty wrote a number of articles for the present day events. Brother Charlie French died a few years ago at age 89. Brother Lafferty kept it going in the Splinters, releasing news articles from Jerusalem. Everyone should subscribe to this because, as we said, we are watchers and we like to know things that are happening in Israel. The article that attracted my attention was in Splinters number 99, and it refers to Kit 300. And the article says it sounds like Harry Potter's invisible cloak. Hezbollah in Lebanon has obtained advanced equipment allowing it to both visualize and observe via thermal imaging along the Israeli border. A new development which requires countermeasures by Israel. A thin material called Kit 300 that contained microfibers, metals and polymers woven into a lightweight sheet-like material weighing only 500 grams, just over a pound, is now available to the Israeli Defense Force. It has been developed by Polaris Solutions, which is an Israeli firm based in Caesarea that specializes in innovative and effective technology for survivability solutions in partnership with the Israeli Defense Ministry. The material effectively shields both personnel and objects from visual sight as well as from electronic detection. Dr. Gal Harari, a spokesman for the ministry, said soldiers on the move can wrap themselves in the sheet. Soldiers installing military positions can join sheets together and form a barrier resembling rock. Individual sheets may be folded into small rolls. Anyone staring at them with binoculars from afar will not see the soldiers. Polaris is working with other companies to develop camouflage unique to their needs. Internationally, Kit 300 is also called Jag Hide. Now, that was a news article recorded in the Splinters, doing the work that the present day events used to do. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I want to take you now to Joel chapter 3. You may find this application of this prophecy unlikely because it is very confronting, but I insist that we find an event after the return to the land of Palestine and after Jerusalem was taken from occupiers and is now in the hands of the Jewish people again. The times of the Gentiles were fulfilled when Judah and Jerusalem were in Jewish hands. And it says in verse 1 of Joel chapter 3, "For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem." So when that happens, it is agreed the bringing again of the captivity of Judah happened in 1948 and Jerusalem in 1967. So everything mentioned in Joel chapter 3 happened after that time. You can argue against this conclusion if you like, but you ignore statements that clearly speak of Israel in the land today. In verse 2 it says, I also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. So whatever is spoken about must relate to a time period after the events of verse 1, when the nations are carving up all the land of Palestine to suit themselves. I remind you also that this is calling for a court scene that is spoken of in Isaiah 41. There is no identifiable valley called Jehoshaphat, so it simply refers to the place of Yah's judgment, which is what Jehoshaphat means. European nations are already there to plead to bring a legal issue before the court. God blames the nations for scattering and for the way they have treated Israel in the dispersion. To part my land is to partition the land as the United Nations has done by a vote of all the nations. It is God's land and they have no right to divide it. So these nations who respond to the crisis in Palestine, they have assembled to petition the land to negotiate a solution to the Palestinian problem. I remind you that Palestinians are not sons of Ishmael, as Muslims claim to be. They are Philistines. In verse 3 it says, they have cast lots for my people. They have given a boy for an harlot and sold a girl for wine that they may drink. Now, these are charges that God brings against the nations of the world. It will be up to God to detail the charges. Knowing what we do of their treatment, it comes as no surprise that these charges are true. In verse 4 it says, yea, and what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Zidon, and all the coasts of Palestine? Will ye render me a recompense? And if ye recompense me, swiftly and speedily will I return your recompense upon your own head. Mention of Tyre and Zidon would have to occur in the press from 1967 to today. It is not unreasonable to decide the events of 2006 refer to this. The conflict was engineered by Hezbollah and the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Gaza when they both took Israeli soldiers hostage. Now, it may be thought that it could be this event, but the question remains, if it is not this event, then which event is it? And if not this event, why not? It has to be an event after Judah and Jerusalem are in the hands of the Jews. That is, since 1967. The details of this battle are given below. On the 4th of August 2006, Hezbollah unleashed a rocket storm in Lebanon. Around 4,000 rockets were fired at Israeli targets. Israel responded with rockets designed to retrace the path of the projectile just fired at them. The result was Israel's rocket landed on the spot from which Hezbollah's rocket was launched. For the first time in world history, told that Tyre and Zidon are in the daily news and attract front page status because Hezbollah had fired their rockets from residential building sites in these two cities. The destruction was startling. The Israelis were roundly condemned for targeting non-combatants. An international uproar followed, but as the Israelis pointed out, Hezbollah fired their rockets from these residential areas. The residents had been removed in anticipation, for they knew Israel had this capability, and all they wanted was the sympathy from the sensational press, and they captured the front page. Now notice what actually happened here. They fired their rocket at Israel, claiming it is for crimes Israel has committed against the Palestinian people. So it was payback for events of the past. God in Joel tells them, if you send me a recompense, then swiftly and speedily he will return their recompense upon their own head. So before they could take apart the firing station and before they had vacated the area, a rocket landed within meters of the place from which the first had been launched. To say it another way, it landed on their own head as a recompense from God. We know the Israelis fired the rocket, but they used advanced technology made available to them only. God claims to be the one who gave it to them. Verse 5, it says, because ye have taken my silver and my gold and have carried into your temples my goodly pleasant things. This complaint would be against Islam as a religious idea. Hezbollah is one of the many militant arms of the Muslim people, but God holds them responsible for hijacking Jerusalem with the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and other relics of Islam, securing the place relating to Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold to the Grecians, that ye may remove them far from their land. So the Jews in the land have vacated the land, and it has been that way for 2,000 years. No doubt the events in that period will be brought before the court to confirm the charges. Behold, I will raise them out of the place whither ye have sold them, and I will return your recompense upon your own head. This refers to the regathering in 1948. Many events have occurred since this time that might cause the people of Tyre and Sidon to regret their mistreatment of Israel. To argue the recompense could refer to any one of these events instead of the one cited in verse 4 is avoiding the issue. I will sell your sons in verse 8 and your daughters into the hand of the children of Judah, and they shall sell them to the Sabaeans, to a people far off, for Yahweh hath spoken it. And in verse 9, proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up. Now, you will realize that that what happened in Lebanon in that encounter was that the Palestinians removed the residents from the residential buildings. They fired their rockets on Israel, knowing full well that the Israelis would measure their projectile and trace back to the spot where the rocket was fired and send a barrage back on their own head. But this event actually incited mistrust on the part of the countries of the world and alarm and distress that Israel were targeting non-combatant people. Now, I've drawn your attention to Jeremiah because Jeremiah has information about end-day events in the land. I mentioned Brother Bruce Philp and his attempts to get news. I've mentioned Brother Charlie French and his efforts to publish information we really need to know as watchers. And we have encountered the Splinters magazine, which publication that brings us in touch with news items out of Jerusalem and Israel. I just want to draw your attention to Jeremiah chapter 33 and verse 20. There God says, if you can break my covenant of the day and my covenant of the night, and that there should not be day and night in their season, then may also my covenant be broken with David, my servant, that he should not have a son to reign upon his throne. and with the Levites, the priests, my ministers. As the host of heaven cannot be numbered, neither the sand is measured, so will I multiply the seed of David my servant and the Levites that minister unto me. So there is God's statement in the book of Jeremiah about his intention concerning Israel. If you can change day and night, shift them around, alter the sequence, do anything to change those arrangements, then God will abandon Israel. In verse 23, it reads, moreover, the word of Yahweh came to Jeremiah, saying, considerest thou not what this people have spoken, saying, the two families which Yahweh hath chosen, he hath even cast them off. Thus they have despised my people, that they should be no more a nation before them. Now, this is what we are used to hearing out of the Middle East and out of Palestine. This is what we're hearing from the church fathers, who claim that God has abandoned Israel and will have nothing more to do with them because they slew his son. But thus saith Yahweh in verse 25, if my covenant be not with day and night, and I have not appointed the ordinances of heaven and earth, then will I cast away the seed of Jacob and David my servant, so that I will not take any of his seed to be rulers over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for I will cause their captivity to return and have mercy on them. So what I'm saying to you, brethren and sisters, is Jeremiah is primarily written to tell the story of the return. What I'm saying is God has declared very plainly that his intention is to establish his king in Jerusalem to rule the world in the kingdom of God. Universally denied by every religious teacher in the world, and yet precious to the Christadelphian community, and it has been for many, many years. So, brethren and sisters, as we partake of the bread and the wine, let us remember that God has his covenant with day and night, and as surely as these things happen, so he will not only return Israel to the land of Palestine, he will not only give back Jerusalem to the Jews so the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled, but he will bring about the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. We look forward to our readings of Jeremiah as we progress through the days.